It's well known that in Paris, visiting the catacombs is a major tourist attraction. But did you know that there are catacombs in Manhattan? That's in New York City. Furthermore, did you know that there are 2 St. Patrick's Cathedrals in Manhattan? There's the prominent neo-Gothic landmark cathedral on Fifth Avenue, which is the seat of the Archbishop of New York. And then there's the lesser-known Basilica St. Patrick's Old Cathedral. It's a mouthful. The brain has to slow down a bit to grip onto all of those words. The Basilica of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral was the first cathedral in the Diocese of New York. It was the second Catholic church in New York City and the third Catholic church in the state of New York. I had to make sure that I got all of those facts right. Basilica St. Patrick's Old Cathedral is located in the Nolita neighborhood of Lower Manhattan. Nolita is derived from north of Little Italy, and it's located at 263 Mulberry Street. It was built between 1809 and 1815. Below the basilica are catacombs, which are crypts that are connected with corridors and hallways. And the catacombs and the cemetery around this church are the only opportunity to be interred in Manhattan, alongside some prominent Catholics, I might add, and at a hefty price. Last July, I had the opportunity to tour Basilica St. Patrick's Old Cathedral. And while they didn't allow video recording, I was able to take pictures. So this video is a representation of what I saw and what I learned during that tour. The tour begins from an office inside the church building just off of Mulberry Street. This is the least amount of decoration you've probably ever seen in front of a Catholic church in your life, because in 1866 it caught fire. There was a wood-burning stove that someone let get out of hand, and with the interior roof made of wood, it burnt down. It had to be rebuilt, and the inside is going to look much nicer. On the front of the church, you'll see IHS, which is a Christogram. It's a Latinized version of the Greek letters iota, eta, sigma, the first 3 letters of the name Jesus in Greek. In front of the church are stairs leading down to the catacombs, consisting of 35 family crypts and 5 clerical vaults. They replaced the trap-style door 3 years ago with a window so people could look down and it could be walked on top of. Later, you'll see what it looks like from underneath. Surrounding the church is a cemetery. Years ago, a mile north of New York, it was all forest and farmland. As the city grew, the Vatican named New York as its own diocese in 1808, so they needed a cathedral for the incoming bishop. They already owned this piece of land, which is why the church was built here. A graveyard is designated as such when it's attached to a church, whereas a cemetery stands on its own. This was cemetery property first, so they call it a cemetery. There are graves of Civil War heroes, aristocrats, and other citizens of 19th century New York. The oldest headstones are from 1803, and they're made largely of limestone and some sandstone, which doesn't last over time, so it's really unknown how many people are truly buried there. For every headstone you see, you have to assume there are 10 graves you can't see. Some records have been lost over the years, and there are also family crypts, and it's unknown how many people are buried in those crypts. If you move the stone aside, the top stone of the crypt aside, there are steps going down, and there may be 10 or a dozen people down there. Pierre Toussaint was born in 1766 in Haiti. Pierre was enslaved and trained as a hairdresser. He became one of the best hairdressers in New York City. Eliza Hamilton was one of his customers. Yes, Alexander Hamilton's wife. He was servicing many of the wealthiest in town. He brought in a lot of money and his owners let him keep some percentage of the money he was making. When his owner died, Pierre had the opportunity to buy his own freedom, but he chose not to. He stayed on to support the widow and paid for the freedom of some of the other slaves. On her deathbed, the owner set him free, and he took the name Toussaint for himself. He went back to work and became a philanthropist. With his hairdressing money, he and his wife established their own house as an orphanage. He also created an employment center, so when freed slaves would come to New York, he'd help them get set up on their feet. There were multiple disease outbreaks where he and his wife would go into quarantine areas and work with the nurses. He was one of the main funders for the construction of the building, the Basilica. He paid for it. When they first opened up for their first service, Pierre tried to come in through the front door, and an usher stopped him. Another usher saw it, and recognizing Pierre, said to let him in. But the main point is that he still had to deal with that. When he got his freedom, he went back to work, and there are records of people saying to him, "Why are you working? You're free. You're rich." Pierre said, "I have enough for myself. If I stop working, I will not have enough for others." Buried in 1853 at 87 years old, which was a very respectable age at that time, he was venerated in 1996. This stone is from 1996 and marks the spot where he was buried. Upon being venerated, he was reinterred at Big St. Patrick's. That's that big cathedral I mentioned early on, up off Fifth Avenue. He's the only one who is not an archbishop or a cardinal at Big St. Patrick's. Born enslaved, died free and wealthy, and is on his way to becoming a saint. John Dubois was the third bishop of New York. His headstone is on the front steps. The dates on the stone are the years he was the bishop. Why is he buried in the steps? He was a Frenchman who was put in charge of the only Irish parish, and he never really felt that he was fully accepted by his own congregation. On his deathbed, he said, "Don't bury me in the catacombs, bury me in the steps, because everyone walked over me in life." It's the most French thing I ever heard. He had a sense of humor, and this is the original stone. This was placed here when he died. Inside the church on the left side is the chancel organ, built in 1859 for St. George's Chapel in Newburgh, New York. At some point, the organ was put into storage and later purchased by the Basilica. This was a fully Irish parish when it opened. In the 1880s, there was a flood of immigration from Italy. The stained glass that you'll see all the way up in the altar is Irish from 1868. The stained glass you'll see on the right and left sides of the church are Italian design from the early 20th century, and you can tell from the different symbols they use. The ceiling and columns of the church design the skeletal structure. Everything that looks as though it is carved out of stone is made out of iron. The factory was able to do it quickly and cheaply, and it's very strong. This was important in the rebuilding of the church after the fire. The baptism scene in The Godfather was filmed in the Old Cathedral, as was the scene in The Godfather Part 3, in which Michael Corleone receives an honor from the church. Behind the altar are 10 statues of apostles. Why are there only 10 of the apostles shown here? I'm not sure which ones are depicted. There do appear to be brass nameplates, but it's unclear to me if these plates hold the names of apostles or perhaps some donors. So if anyone knows why only 10 of the apostles are shown here and which ones they are, I would love to hear it in the comments. Please let me know. We're going to talk about the gallery organ, and the day I toured, I was lucky enough that the organist was there practicing. So I'm going to play a little bit of the sound where you'll hear the organ moaning. It's doing this warm up, and then just some light playing of nothing in particular. We're just warming up the organ. The gallery organ in St. Patrick's Old Cathedral was built from 1866 to 1868 by Henry Urban of New York City. Urban installed the organ in a Gothic-style case that's grained to look like walnut. Very little work was ever done on the instrument. The neglect has turned out to be fortunate, as it's an exceptional survivor from that era and is the only example of an original, extant, 3-manual, urban, and is a jewel of organ building in New York City. In Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, over a dozen Catholic churches were burned to the ground between the years of 1800 and 1834 by anti-Catholic mobs trying to drive them out. John Hughes was the bishop who started fighting back. Born in Ireland in 1797 and came to America in 1816. Laws against Catholics owning property, buried in cemeteries. Here in America, a brand new country, telling the whole world we've got religious freedom and the Constitution. He came to America for that religious freedom. He gets off the boat and finds out people are hating Catholics here too. He started studying to become a priest because he wanted to be in a position to lead his people. He was not born into it. This was a lower-class, uneducated man. He was working as a ditch digger in Maryland. Hughes' first New York crusade was to get his flock educated, so that they could benefit from the new nation's almost limitless opportunity. This headstone doesn't seem to belong because it's modern, it's out of place. In 1879, 15 people, including Mr. Curry, saw a vision of the Virgin Mary on the outer wall of the church in Knock, Ireland. It's known as the Apparition of Knock. His family then came to America, and they lived in Long Island, where he was buried in a cemetery in Farmingdale in 1943. Since then, the church in Knock has become a shrine. In May of 2017, Cardinal Dolan had John Curry moved from the cemetery in Farmingdale over here. Over 1,000 people gathered for the reburial. Ireland's prime minister at the time came out for it too. A brick wall surrounds the basilica, which was initially built to protect the congregants who were experiencing a lot of harassment and violence at the hands of the nativist segment of the New York population. The cathedral's walled graveyard was the setting for a scene in the film Mean Streets, directed by Martin Scorsese, a former altar server at the cathedral. In his 2002 film Gangs of New York, Martin Scorsese included a scene in which a fictionalized Hughes, who I mentioned earlier, rallies a crowd of Irish toughs armed to the teeth to protect his cathedral from a nativist mob threatening to burn it. When Scorsese was a student in a Bronx Catholic high school in the late 1950s, he had learned about the real Hughes and his supposed threat in 1844 to the city's mayor that he would tell the Irish to turn New York into a second Moscow if one of his churches was touched. That means he's referring to Napoleon had burned Moscow to the ground in 1812. The gate to the cemetery may look old, but it's not. We know this is a recent and decorative door, mainly based on the peephole opening from the outside instead of the inside. When you come from outside and walk downstairs, this is the Catacombs entrance. You'll see the original perimeter wall of the church and also see some of the burnt wood remnants from the 1866 fire. This area below was actually the space where the Italians used to worship while the Irish were upstairs in the cathedral having Mass. Let's focus on this still image of Jesus that was behind the altar in the 2 Godfather movies. Here is a still shot of the Godfather 3 movie, in which Michael Corleone receives an honor from the church. You can see the painting in the background. In the clerical vault, you have something here to indicate it was a crypt, but it didn't have the names of those who are buried here on it. There used to be a practice in certain Catholic churches for priests to be buried in unmarked graves by not having worldly connections. Here you can see, from the inside looking up to the front of the church, the steps from the catacombs up to the front of the church. Among the notable internments are the first resident bishop of New York, John Connolly. There's General Thomas Eckert, who had many accomplishments, but the one that I happen to remember is that his desk was used by Abraham Lincoln. He wrote the Emancipation Proclamation on top of it. There are several members of the Delmonico restaurant family who, aside from serving great steaks, also introduced us to Eggs Benedict and Baked Alaska. There's Countess Annie Leary and Congressman John Kelly. This final shot is of a Basilica sheep. Every September, an upstate farm sends their sheep for a month or two to graze in the cemetery to serve as lawnmowers. This little sheep for sale is made from the wool of those sheep. I hope you enjoyed this tour of Basilica St. Patrick's Old Cathedral in New York City. Thank you for watching.